The nurse slid the intake form across the counter without looking up. Relationship to patient. Damien Rowe stared at the line Karen Bellamy had already filled in her own handwriting and ink before they'd wheeled her away. Husband and medical guardian. He read it twice, then a third time. 20 years ago, they had been each other's first love. Then she left for Paris, and he waited and waited until he didn't. He married someone else, built a life, buried a wife, and raised a daughter alone. And Karen had spent the last 4 months making his professional life miserable. Every meeting, every memo, every cold dismissal across a boardroom table. Yet when she thought she might die tonight, the only name she wrote down was his. 20 years ago, Damien Rowe and Karen Bellamy were the kind of young love that people in small neighborhoods still talked about long after it ended. They had grown up 4 blocks apart, attended the same high school, and fallen into each other somewhere between junior year chemistry and the summer before everything changed. Damien was the practical one, the boy who fixed his uncle's car engine at 15 and had already decided that a steady life, a real home, and people who counted on him were worth more than ambition for its own sake. Karen was the opposite in almost every way. Sharp, restless, certain that the city they lived in was too small for what she intended to become. She didn't say that to be cruel. It was simply the truth she had always known about herself. When she received a full scholarship to study business in Paris, nobody who knew her was surprised. When she told Damien the night before her flight, sitting on the hood of his car, both of them looking at a sky that felt suddenly too wide, he didn't argue. He told her to go. And then quietly he told her he would wait. She promised it would only be a few years. She said when she came back they would pick up exactly where they left off. Build the future they had sketched out in the small, certain way that teenagers do when they believe time is something they can control. For the first few months they called often. Letters went back and forth. Then the time zones and the coursework and the distance began to wear at the edges of everything, and the calls grew shorter and the letters less frequent. What Damien didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Karen's father, a man of precise ambitions and very little sentiment, had been quietly intercepting his correspondence. The physical letters never reached her. The emails sent to the family account her father still managed went into a folder she never saw. He had decided without consulting anyone that his daughter's future was not going to be determined by a boy from the neighborhood who fixed other people's cars. What he could not control was Damien's messages to Karen's personal cell phone. Those got through, but they were fewer. Damien assumed she preferred the longer letters and called less often as the months grew silent on her end. What Karen received was a trickle where there should have been a current. She began to read his reduced contact as proof that a man who truly loved her would have fought harder. She was 19 and proud and a long way from home, and so she did what proud, hurting people sometimes do. She picked up her phone and sent him a message designed to provoke a reaction. "You don't have to wait for me anymore. Go live your life." She expected him to push back. She expected him to call immediately or book a flight, or at the very minimum respond with something that proved she still mattered more than his pride. What she did not expect was silence. Not immediate silence, but the slow, terrible kind. Damien wrote back through every means he had. He sent letters she never received. He emailed the family account her father quietly managed. He waited the way he had said he would for nearly 2 years. And then on a gray Tuesday that he would not remember clearly, he sent a final message directly to her cell phone, the one line of contact her father had never touched. "I'll wait if you tell me there's still a future for us. But I can't keep living in the silence." Karen read it. She was sitting in a lecture hall in Paris, her phone under the desk, and she read every word. And because she was 20 years old and had not yet learned that pride was not the same thing as strength, she did not reply. She told herself she was testing him. She told herself that if he really meant it, he would keep waiting without needing her to say so. He didn't. He waited a few more months, then he stopped. A few years later, Damien met a woman named Audrey, a nurse, calm and honest and warm in a way that asked nothing of him except that he show up. She knew there had been someone before her, something that had left a mark, and she didn't ask him to pretend otherwise. What she offered was real, and Damien recognized it as such. He married her. They had a daughter they named Laya. He built the steady life he had always wanted, and he loved Audrey with the kind of love that doesn't announce itself, it simply holds. When Karen returned to the United States and learned that Damien had gotten married, she felt the bottom drop out of a room she hadn't realized she was still standing in. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she had moved on first, that Paris had made her someone larger than the girl who had cried in airport departure lounges. She built Bellamy Technologies into a company worth $300 million. She became someone whose name appeared in business publications, someone who did not wait on anyone. But she never forgot, and she never entirely forgave. Audrey died after several years of illness. Damien was left to raise Leah alone, a widower at 35, driving his daughter to school, attending parent-teacher conferences, learning to cook the meals Audrey had always made. He did not fall apart. He had a daughter who needed him to stay assembled, and so he did. 4 years later, the mid-sized tech company where Damien worked as operations director was acquired by Bellamy Technologies. He didn't know until the morning of the announcement. He was standing in the back of the company's main hall with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand when the doors opened and Karen Bellamy walked in. Composed, impeccable, exactly as certain of herself as she had been at 18, but now wearing it differently. She looked like someone who had stopped needing anyone's approval so long ago that she had forgotten what the wanting felt like. She saw him immediately. She didn't flinch. She walked to the front of the room, addressed the assembled staff with the kind of smooth authority that closes down questions before they form, and then at the end let her gaze drift back to him. Finally, she said, and only Damien was close enough to hear it clearly, "You work for me now." Karen kept him. Every other senior employee from the acquired company was reassigned or let go within the first 6 weeks. Damien was moved laterally into the role of head of operations, reporting directly to her. She told Human Resources it was a matter of institutional knowledge and operational efficiency. She told herself the same thing often enough that she almost believed it. The truth was simpler and less comfortable. She wanted him where she could see him. She wanted him to watch her run the company he now worked for. She wanted him in every strategy meeting, every quarterly review, every moment where her authority was most visible, so that he would have no way to avoid understanding exactly who she had become in the years he had not been around to see it. She wanted him to look at her and feel the weight of what he had walked away from. So she made his job difficult. She rejected proposals he submitted without full explanation. She interrupted his presentations in front of junior staff. She scheduled last-minute meetings that conflicted with his standing commitments and then noted his absence in writing. It was never egregious enough to constitute a formal complaint. It was precise and sustained and deliberate. And yet when a senior director pushed to terminate Damien after he requested an emergency half-day to take Leah to a specialist appointment, Karen shut it down in under 30 seconds. No explanation. She simply looked at the director and said the matter was closed. When Leah had to spend an afternoon waiting in the Bellamy Technologies lobby because after-school pickup fell through, Karen had her assistant quietly prepare the small conference room on the 3rd floor, the one with the couch and the good lighting, with a meal from the cafeteria and a phone charger. She told no one she had done it. She was relentless with Damien professionally. She would not let anyone else touch him. Damien noticed. He wasn't a man who missed things that were directly in front of him. He understood that Karen was angry, had been angry for a long time, and that the anger was aimed at him with a precision that was not accidental. He did not explain himself. He thought about it more than once, pulling her aside and laying out the facts of what had happened 20 years ago. But every time he reached the edge of that conversation, he pulled back. It felt like dragging Audrey's memory into something she had no part in. It felt like exposing Leah to a conflict that didn't belong to her. So he stayed quiet, did his job, and waited. On a Thursday evening in November, the floor had emptied by 9 o'clock. Damien was finishing a logistics report when he noticed the light still on in Karen's office. He knocked and found her at her desk phone in one hand, 3 open windows on her screen, a takeout container she hadn't opened sitting at the edge of the desk. "You haven't eaten," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't need commentary on my eating habits from my operations director." He set the container closer to her and turned to leave. She spoke before he reached the door. "You don't have to perform concern. You're always very good at moving on." He stopped, turned back slowly. "Moving on," he said, "isn't the same thing as not having been broken first." She opened her mouth, closed it. Something moved across her face. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something that lived between the two. And then she pressed her hand flat against her sternum and exhaled sharply. Her chair rolled back. She reached for the desk, missed, and went down. Damien crossed the room in 3 strides. He was already on the phone with emergency services when he knelt beside her, and she was already reaching for his hand before either of them understood what they were doing. He carried her to the elevator. He drove her to the emergency room himself because waiting for an ambulance felt like something he was not willing to do. She was semi-conscious on the way to the hospital, her head back against the seat and her eyes mostly closed, but her hand was wrapped around his wrist and she would not let go. She said something twice that he had to lean toward her to hear. "Don't leave me behind again." He didn't answer. He drove. At the intake desk, the triage nurse told him the patient needed to fill in an emergency contact form before they could move forward. Karen was alert enough barely to sit upright for 4 minutes, take the clipboard, and write. Damien stood at the counter. The nurse looked at the form, then looked at him. "Sir, it says here you're her husband." He took the form. Under relationship to person accompanying patient, Karen had written husband. Under designated medical decision-maker in the event of incapacitation, she had written Damien Rowe, medical guardian. He assumed she was confused. He assumed the chest pain and the adrenaline had loosened something in her cognition. The nurse pulled up her patient file. 6 months prior, Karen Bellamy had visited this same hospital following a cardiac arrhythmia diagnosis. At that visit, she had completed a formal medical power of attorney, a legal document designating her chosen representative in the event she could not make decisions for herself. She had filed it with the hospital, signed it in front of a notary, and attached a copy of her désignée's personal information pulled from the company's human resources records. The designated representative was Damien Rowe. The attending physician found Damien in the hallway 10 minutes later and told him quietly that Karen's condition might require an emergency procedure. If she lost the capacity to consent, Damien would need to authorize treatment on her behalf. He had the legal standing to do so. The question was whether he was willing. He stood there in that hallway under fluorescent light, holding a clipboard with a document he had not asked to be part of, making a decision about a woman who had spent 4 months trying to make him feel small. He could step back. He could call her attorney, her board, her assistant, anyone whose name actually made sense on that form. Nobody would blame him. He picked up the pen. "She might be furious at me when she wakes up," he said to the doctor. "Before that happens, do whatever she needs." He signed the form and handed it back. The news reached the Bellamy Technologies board before sunrise. By 7 in the morning, Victor Lang was in the hospital lobby with a corporate attorney and a document printed on firm letterhead. He was 61 years old, had been on the Bellamy board for 11 years, and had twice attempted and twice failed to build enough votes to remove Karen from the CEO position. He had watched her run the company her father built with the kind of competent authority that made opposition difficult to articulate. She never gave him a clean opening. Until now. Victor had spent years as the largest outside investor in Bellamy Technologies before Karen consolidated control of the board. He believed with the conviction of someone who had been waiting a long time that the company should have been his to direct. Every governance move Karen made that succeeded was in his view a postponement rather than a resolution. He was not a man who stopped waiting simply because the wait was long. He did not go to the hospital because he was concerned about her health. He went because the word husband had appeared on a legal intake form filed under the Bellamy Technologies insurance network, and by 6:45 that morning, someone inside the hospital administration had made a phone call they shouldn't have. He requested a formal review of the medical power of attorney on the grounds that Damien Rowe was a subordinate employee with a prior romantic history with the CEO, and therefore could not be considered a neutral party in medical decision-making. He had his attorney draft a motion to temporarily suspend the guardianship designation pending investigation. Then he called 2 members of the board and used the word manipulation. By afternoon, the narrative had escaped. A grieving widower, financially strained by years of single parenthood and medical costs from his late wife's illness, had re-entered the life of a wealthy CEO and positioned himself as her closest confidant. The intake form wasn't evidence of a vulnerable woman reaching for someone she trusted. According to Victor's version, it was the result of a calculated campaign. Damien heard the outline of it from a hospital administrator who pulled him aside gently to let him know that his authority as medical guardian was being formally contested. He was told to remain available. He was told the situation was being reviewed. He stood in the corridor outside Karen's room and did not raise his voice. He understood that leaving would look like flight, and he was not someone who fled. But he also understood that he could not fight a legal motion from a hospital hallway, and that the longer this continued, the more of Laya's world would get pulled into the radius of it. Laya was staying with the neighbor. She was 13, and she had her mother's habit of reading the news before school. She called him at 8 that evening. "Dad." Her voice was careful the way it got when she was trying not to worry him. There's stuff online about you and some woman. I know. Is she the reason you never wanted to date anyone after Mom? Damien was quiet for a moment. Karen is someone I knew a long time ago. Before your mother. Your mom was my choice, Laya. She's the one I built our family with. A pause on the other end. Then, so why did this woman choose you to be her guardian? He had no answer that would fit inside a phone call. He told Laya he loved her, and that he would explain everything properly when he got home. And then he sat down in a plastic chair outside her room and stared at the floor for a long time. Karen was awake by the following morning. Her color was better. The arrhythmia had been stabilized, and the attending cardiologist had downgraded the immediate threat. Though he was clear that surgery remained a possibility depending on how the next 48 hours went. Damien walked in and set a copy of the intake form on the tray table in front of her. He didn't sit down. Sit. Tell me why you wrote that. She looked at the form, her jaw tightened. I wasn't thinking clearly. The pain was... The medical power of attorney was notarized 6 months ago. He placed that document beside the first one. You filled it out at this hospital. You used my personal information from the Human Resources database. You were completely lucid. She said nothing. So I'll ask again, why is my name on that form? Karen looked out the window. The morning was gray and flat, the kind of sky that offered nothing. When she looked back at him, something in her expression had changed. Not softened exactly, but reorganized the way a face looks when a person stops deciding what to show and starts simply showing it. Because I can be angry at you, she said, and still trust you more than anyone else I know. The silence between them had weight. Damien pulled the chair to the side of the bed and sat. You've been making my life difficult since the day I walked into that acquisition meeting. You've rejected every proposal I've submitted, scheduled conflicts into my calendar, and let your directors speak to me in ways you would have fired them for if they'd done it to anyone else. He paused. What was the actual plan, Karen? She exhaled. It came out uneven. I wanted you to see me every day. Her voice was controlled, but the words cost her something. I wanted you to walk into those boardrooms and understand what you gave up. I wanted you to look at everything I built and feel what I felt when I came back here and found out you had a wife and a daughter and a life that had no space in it for me. She stopped. I wanted you to regret it. Damien didn't flinch. He sat with it for a moment the way he sat with most hard things, not rushing past, not filling the air. Audrey was not a decision I made against you, he said finally. She was a woman who loved me when I had nothing left to offer, but grief over someone who told me to move on. She raised our daughter. She stayed when staying was hard. He looked directly at Karen. You don't get to position her as the consolation prize. I never said... You didn't have to say it. You built an entire punishment around the assumption that I chose her to replace you. His voice was steady and quiet and did not make room for interruption. You told me not to wait. I believed you. Then you came back and hated me for taking you at your word. Karen opened her mouth, closed it. I only wrote that because I was angry, she said, and her voice was smaller now. I thought you'd understand that I didn't mean it. I thought you'd push back. You asked me to let go, he said, and then spent 20 years punishing me for letting go. She looked at him. The hospital room was very quiet. Outside, a cart rolled past in the hallway and someone laughed at the nursing station, and those ordinary sounds made the silence inside the room feel larger. When she finally spoke again, the composure was gone. I forgave you a long time ago, she said. Her voice broke once cleanly, and she did not try to hide it. But if I admitted that I had to admit I was still in love with you, so I stayed angry. It was easier to stay angry than to show up in front of you and say I never stopped. I just didn't know how to get close to you without the anger holding me up. Damien was still. The thing that had been between them, that 20-year tension built from silence and misread signals, and pride layered on top of hurt, did not dissolve exactly, but it changed shape. What had looked like hatred revealed itself as its nearest neighbor. What had felt like punishment revealed itself as proximity. She had kept him in her building, in her orbit, in her line of sight, because it was the only way she knew how to not lose him again. The danger now was different. It was no longer Karen's anger that could do damage. It was the love still sitting underneath it, and what that love might cost Damien's daughter, who still kept a photograph of her mother on her nightstand and had not yet been asked to make room for anyone else. Damien did not say yes. He told Karen that whatever was between them could not be built on the foundation of a revenge plan and a medical emergency. He told her he needed her to understand that accepting him meant accepting all of it. Audrey Laya. The years she hadn't been part of the life she had dismissed as a betrayal. He was not willing to let her rewrite that history to make her own grief more bearable. Karen heard him, and for the first time in the 4 months since the acquisition, she did not push back. She asked if she could speak with Leah. The meeting happened 2 days into Karen's hospital stay in the early afternoon when Damien had stepped out to handle a call. Leah came in the way 13-year-olds enter uncomfortable rooms. Contained, evaluating, giving nothing away until she had decided whether anything was worth giving. She sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at Karen the way her father sometimes looked at things. Directly, without aggression, but without mercy either. "Did you love him?" Leah said. "Or did you just want to beat my mom?" Karen did not flinch. She had expected something like this. She had not expected it to land as squarely as it did. "Your mother gave your father a family when I wasn't mature enough to stay," she said. "I can't beat her. I wouldn't want to. What I want is to stop punishing your dad for something that wasn't entirely his fault and wasn't entirely mine either." She paused. "I don't expect you to be fine with any of this. I'm just asking you to know that I understand what I'm asking for, and I know what it costs." Leah studied her for a long moment. Then she stood up, pushed her chair back neatly, and walked to the door. She didn't say anything, but she didn't slam it either. That same afternoon, Victor Lang's office released a statement to 2 financial news outlets. The story about the intake form went public by 4 o'clock. By 6, the board had issued a formal request for Karen to step back from operational decisions, pending a review of her judgment. A board member called her hospital room directly and delivered the terms plainly. If she was willing to state publicly that Damien Rowe had exploited her during a medical vulnerability, the review would be dropped and her position would be secured. 20 years of work. $300 million. Her father's name on the building, all of it in exchange for 1 sentence about a man who had driven her to the emergency room and slept in a waiting room chair. She told the board member she would call back. She did not call back. At 2 o'clock in this morning, her cardiac monitor alarmed. The attending physician came in within minutes and delivered the news with the efficient gentleness of someone who had done this many times. The arrhythmia had progressed. They needed to perform a procedure tonight, not tomorrow, not after the legal situation had been resolved. Tonight. Victor's attorney had filed a motion in district court earlier that night, just before midnight. A judge, persuaded by the argument that a financial conflict of interest existed, had issued a temporary order suspending Damien's guardianship authority pending a full hearing. The hospital's legal team told Damien they could not proceed with the procedure until the order was resolved or a new désigné was formally appointed. Karen's heart was doing something that required intervention, and a piece of paper was in the way. Damien read the order twice. Then he walked to the nurse's station, asked for the hospital's on-call legal representative, and signed a voluntary relinquishment of his guardianship designation. No contest, no delay. He removed himself from the document entirely. Then he went to the Human Resources portal and submitted his resignation from Bellamy Technologies, effective immediately, citing personal conflict of interest. He declined severance. He declined any transitional compensation. He cleared his name from every document that Victor Lang could use to build a story. He went back to Karen's room before they moved her. She was awake. She looked at him with the fear of someone who has learned at a cellular level what it means to watch a person prepare to leave. "I'm not going to let your life be delayed again because of me," he said. "They'll take good care of you." He said it gently, with the certainty of someone who has sat in enough hospital rooms to know what good care looks like. "The procedure is straightforward. You'll be fine." She reached for his hand. The orderly was already at the door. She got 2 seconds of contact. His fingers, her fingers. And then the bed was moving and the door was widening and he was standing in the room alone. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table for an hour in the dark. Then he started packing. He told himself it was logic. Staying kept Karen in the crosshairs of a board dispute that had his name written into it. Staying gave Victor Lang a living, breathing exhibit to point at. Staying meant Leah had to grow up reading her father's name in financial news stories alongside implications about his character. Leaving removed the variable. Leaving was the clean answer. He told himself all of this and believed most of it. What he did not let himself think about in the kitchen at 3 in the morning was the way her hand had felt, or the fact that she had written his name on a form 6 months before she had any reason to think she might need it. When Karen woke from the procedure the next afternoon, the room was quiet in a way that felt different from before. She looked at the chair beside her bed. She looked at the tray table. His relinquishment form was there. So was a copy of his resignation letter. She lay still for a long time. She had told him she still loved him. She had let him see the part of herself she had armored over for 2 decades. And now she was looking at a piece of paper that said he had walked out of the building entirely. History, she thought, had a cruel sense of repetition. The aide who delivered the box was a woman named Ruth, who had worked for the Bellamy family for 23 years and had stayed on after Karen's father passed because she didn't know what else to do with herself. She brought it to the hospital on the 3rd day of Karen's recovery, set it on the tray table without ceremony, and said only that Mr. Bellamy had asked her to hold on to it until the time seemed right. Ruth had apparently decided that nearly dying was right enough. The box was not large. Inside were 31 letters and a printout of an early email thread, correspondence from Damien's first year of writing back when her father still managed the family account, and had printed everything before quietly moving the messages to a folder Karen never accessed. The letters were handwritten in an uneven script she recognized immediately. She had seen it on birthday cards and notebook margins and the inside cover of a paperback he had once given her. They were dated across a span of nearly 2 years, beginning 3 weeks after she had landed in Paris. Her father had kept all of it. He had intercepted the physical letters from the mailbox and printed the early emails from the family account he still controlled, filing them away with the tidy resolve of a man who believed he was protecting an investment. He had never told her. In the final year of his life, when illness made him reflective, he had said once that he had protected her future in ways she might not understand until later. She had assumed he meant the trust restructuring. She had assumed wrong. She read every letter. They were not dramatic. That was what broke her in a way she had not anticipated. They were not the letters of a boy performing devotion. They were ordinary. He wrote about his week. He asked about her classes. He described a broken alternator he had spent a Saturday fixing and the way the finished engine sounded when it finally turned over clean. He said he missed her in the way you miss a person whose absence changes the texture of ordinary days. He said he was waiting, and he said it the way people say things they believe entirely. The last item in the box was the email printout, one of the early ones her father had captured, where Damien wrote that he hadn't heard back in 3 weeks and hoped she was well. Not the final message. That one had gone directly to her cell phone, the one number her father had never controlled. She remembered that final message clearly. She had read it in a lecture hall in Paris, phone under the desk. She remembered the pride that had kept her from typing back the certainty that love requiring reassurance was love not strong enough that if he meant it, he would simply continue without needing her to confirm it. 2 truths arrived together and she had to hold both at once. Her father had hidden 31 letters and skewed the entire landscape of her understanding. And she had read Damien's final message and said nothing. The silence she had blamed entirely on him for 20 years had 2 authors. No one was completely without fault. No one was completely to blame. She set the papers down and looked out the window for a long time. Then she thought about what Damien was doing right now. Packing boxes. Constructing a reasonable explanation for why leaving was the considerate choice. She recognized it because she had done the same thing at 19. She had dressed up fear as logic called self-removal, a form of generosity, and handed the other person a silence they hadn't asked for. He was making her mistake. And she had just enough time and just enough clarity and just barely enough recovered strength to do something about it. She joined the emergency board meeting by live remote feed from her hospital bed with her hair pulled back and an intravenous line still in her left arm, and the full medical power of attorney document visible on the table in front of her so that nobody in the room could miss it. She did not ease into it. I retained Damien Rowe after the acquisition for personal reasons, she said. I wanted him to see what I'd built. I wanted him to understand what he had missed. That was not a sound basis for an operational decision, and I'm acknowledging it now because I'd rather say it clearly than have Victor's version become the official record. The board was very quiet. What Victor hasn't mentioned in his communications to the press is that his attorney filed a motion to suspend my emergency procedure authorization at 11:47 in the evening. My procedure was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the morning. His team knew the timeline. She looked into the camera without blinking. That is not a corporate governance dispute. That is someone who calculated that a 2-hour delay was an acceptable outcome for a cardiac procedure if it improved his position on a board vote. She had documentation. Her attorney had spent 48 hours compiling it, and she walked the board through it in 11 minutes. Then she made two announcements. First, she was voluntarily stepping back from the CEO role for 90 days, while the board conducted a full review, not of her judgment, but of Victor Lang's conduct. She named an interim operational lead and provided the transition document she had drafted from her hospital bed. Second, all adverse findings related to Damien Rowe were to be formally withdrawn. His resignation was not to be accepted. His personnel record was to reflect nothing that had occurred in the past 72 hours. She closed her laptop before anyone could respond. For the first time in 4 months, she had given something up to protect him instead of using something to keep him contained. She found him on a Saturday morning, a timing she had arrived at partly through logistics, and partly because Leia had sent her a text she had not entirely expected to receive, letting her know that Saturday mornings were when Damien was home and not yet moving boxes. She had not told him she was coming. She had decided somewhere in her third day of recovery that asking for permission was its own kind of control, a way of managing outcomes before they happened. She was trying to stop doing that. He opened the door in a gray Henley and looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained several things at once. "You're supposed to be resting," he said. "I've been resting for 4 days. I'm very well rested." He stepped back to let her in. The apartment was in mid-disruption, boxes in various stages of packing, a life partially disassembled. She stood in the middle of the living room and looked at it without commenting. She held out the box. He looked at it. He took it. He sat down on the arm of the couch and went through the contents the way she had, letter by letter, without rushing toward the conclusion. She sat across from him and did not speak. She had learned recently that she was capable of silence that wasn't a weapon. When he set the last letter down, he was quiet for a moment. "My father kept them," she said. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't know. I did read your last message, though." She said it evenly because it needed to be said evenly. "The one you sent to my phone. I read it, and I didn't answer because I thought love was supposed to sustain itself without reassurance. I was wrong about that. I've been wrong about a number of things for a very long time." He set the letters carefully on the table and looked at her. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not the kind I rehearsed in my head where I explain my reasoning until it sounds reasonable. Just, I used my company to punish you. I used my authority to make you feel small, and I called it something other than what it was because I didn't want to admit that what I actually wanted was to be close to you." She stopped. "I'm sorry, Damien." He was quiet for a moment. "I also want to say something about Audrey," she said. He looked up. "I've spent a long time thinking about her in a way that wasn't fair to her. Like she was something that happened to me instead of a person who loved you and raised your daughter and mattered. I don't want to think about her that way anymore." She paused. "I'm not trying to replace her. I want to know who you are now. The father you became, the man she knew, the version of you that exists after all of it. That's what I'm asking for." From the hallway, Leia appeared. She was in socks and an oversized sweatshirt holding a bowl of cereal, and she stopped when she saw the two of them. She looked at her father. She looked at Karen. "I don't have a problem with Dad being happy," she said in the tone of a teenager who has decided to enter a conversation directly rather than be spoken around. "What I have a problem with is someone making him feel guilty for being happy before, with Mom." She looked at Karen. "As long as that's clear." "That's clear," Karen said. Leia nodded once as if a procedural matter had been settled and went back down the hallway. Damien looked at the box of letters on the table. Then he looked at Karen. "I'm not getting back together with who we were," he said. "Those two people made a mess." "I know. I want to start from where we actually are, not from the history, not from what we owe each other." He paused. Two people figuring out if they still make sense from the beginning. Karen looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. It was the first agreement she had made in recent memory that she had no plan to control. The first 6 months were quiet in a way that neither of them had expected to be comfortable with. Karen stepped back from Bellamy Technologies while the board review ran its course. Victor Lang resigned before the investigation concluded. She returned to the CEO role in the spring with a restructured executive team and a reputation that had improbably improved. There was a version of the story that had filtered through financial media in which a CEO had chosen integrity over self-preservation, and people responded to that version with something approaching respect. Damien took a director-level role at a logistics company across the city. He did not tell Karen about it until he had already accepted. She did not tell him he should have consulted her. They were both learning the discipline of staying out of each other's decisions while still being present in each other's lives. They didn't begin with candlelit dinners or weekends away. They began with the car ride to school on Tuesday mornings, when Damien's route took him past Karen's building, and he had started without either of them formally agreeing to it, stopping to pick her up so she could ride the 12 blocks with them before he dropped Leia off. They talked about nothing important, traffic, what Leia's history teacher had said about a deadline, whether the coffee place on the corner had gotten better or worse. Ordinary things, the kind that accumulate into a life without announcing themselves. Karen was not naturally good at ordinary things. She had spent so long operating at high stakes that the small, unguarded moments felt unfamiliar, like wearing clothes in a fabric she hadn't encountered before. She got better at them slowly. She burned dinner twice and didn't try to reframe it as intentional. She sat with Leia on Sunday afternoons while the girl did homework and did not offer unsolicited efficiency improvements. She asked questions and waited for the answers. Leia did not warm to her in a single moment. It happened in increments: a borrowed phone charger, an opinion requested about a school essay, a Saturday afternoon where Karen drove her to a friend's house without making it feel like a grand gesture. One evening, without any context, Leia said, "You're not as exhausting as I thought you'd be." Karen decided to take it as a compliment. They visited Audrey's grave on a Sunday in October, the three of them, and Karen stood back while Damien and Leia did what they always did, which was mostly stand there quietly for a few minutes, which was enough. Karen had brought flowers she hadn't announced. She set them at the base of the headstone without explanation, and neither Damien nor Leia said anything about it, and that felt exactly right. 18 months after the night Damien had carried Karen out of her office, he drove her back to the neighborhood where they had both grown up. The street looked the way old streets look when you haven't seen them in 20 years. Smaller than memory and somehow more specific than you'd expected. He stopped the car at the end of the block where his uncle's garage had been. The building was a dry cleaner now. He got out anyway. She followed. He had the ring in his coat pocket. He was not someone who rehearsed speeches, so he didn't have one. He said what was true. "The first time we loved each other, we did it with promises," he said. "I want to do it differently now. I want to love you with choices, the ones we make every day on purpose after knowing everything." She said yes before he finished the sentence. The following spring, Karen went to the hospital for a routine cardiac follow-up. The waiting room was ordinary. Pale walls, stacked magazines, a television showing weather on mute. Damien sat beside her. Leia, who had insisted on coming because she had decided that her parents were medically irresponsible when left unsupervised, sat on her other side with her headphones around her neck. The intake nurse handed Karen a form. She filled in her name, her insurance, her date of birth. She reached the last section. Under relationship to person accompanying patient, she wrote husband. Under designated medical decision maker, she wrote Damien Rowe, husband and medical guardian. She passed the form across to Damien to countersign. He read both lines. He looked at her. "You sure this time?" She smiled. "Last time I wrote it because I was afraid I was running out of time. This time I'm writing it because I'm not running from anything." Leia leaned over, read both lines, and sat back. "I'm listing myself as guardian for both of you," she said. "Somebody has to be the responsible one." The nurse called Karen's name. The three of them stood up together. 20 years earlier, two people had lost each other because one said something she didn't mean, and the other believed her because a father hid letters, because pride was mistaken for strength, and silence was mistaken for a test, and waiting was mistaken for weakness. Neither of them was entirely innocent. Neither was entirely to blame. And it was the uncomfortable, honest middle ground where most real love stories actually live that made it possible to come back. They didn't return to who they were. That version of the story was finished. What they built instead was something that could only exist after all of it. The loss, the years apart, the grief, the anger, the moment one of them finally stopped punishing and the other finally stopped running. Don't use silence as a test. Don't let pride speak for you when honesty is what's actually needed. And if you've been holding on to anger because letting it go means admitting you still care, maybe it's time to put it down.